One of the great paradoxes of American history is the establishment of slavery and freedom. How did these two evolve? In Origins of Slavery and Race, historian Reiko Hillier explains that for decades, historians have been trying to identify the exact relationship between race and American slavery. Historian Edmund Morgan wrote, "The rise of liberty and equality in America was accompanied by the rise of slavery." In his piece, Slavery and Freedom, The American Paradox. The core of this presentation is dedicated to the comparison of two historians, Edmund Morgan and Winthrop Jordan, and their views of the origins of slavery and racism. Morgan and Jordan share similar views in that they both acknowledge the oppression and exploitation of African slaves. However, Morgan focuses economic needs as the driving force of slavery, whereas Jordan emphasizes that racist ideology predated slavery and was a driving force behind the enslavement of black Africans. What is interesting is that Edmund Morgan does not deny racism when he tries to uncover the paradox between slavery and freedom. He wrote in Slavery and Freedom, The American Paradox, that racism was certainly an essential element in it, but it goes to suggest other factors that he believes to have influenced the development of slavery and freedom, focusing on the growing number of freemen in America. Morgan also emphasizes that as America struggled to become a dominant and separate nation in the world, they relied heavily on slave labor, mostly in part because tobacco production was a labor-intensive process. The problem that elite Americans ran into was that in Virginia especially, the number of freemen who had served their term of indentured servitude quickly grew. These men put the fear in the eyes of the elite because they were mainly single men, who were aggressive, propertyless, armed, and rebellious. Especially after Bacon's Rebellion, in which freemen rose up against landed elite. They realized they need to find a better source of labor in which they could control for their benefit. Inherited slave labor seemed like a logical answer to the problem because this system would ensure the servants would be working for a lifetime. According to Morgan, African slaves could be deprived of the opportunity for association and rebellion. They could be kept unarmed and unorganized, and since color disclosed their probable status, the rest of society could keep close watch on them. In contrast, Winthrop Jordan argues that racial prejudice predated slavery and thus led to its evolvement. In White Over Black, Jordan writes that, "For Englishmen planting in America then, it was of the utmost importance to know that they were Englishmen, which was to say that they were educated, Christian, civilized, and free men. Therefore, when the first Africans came to America in the early 17th century, it made sense to enslave them because they did not compare to these ideal statuses." Jordan comments that the concept of blackness held such an intense meaning in the Englishmen, even before they had the knowledge of people being different color. To be black was to be deeply stained with dirt, to be malignant, and liable to punishment. To Englishmen, white and black connoted purity and filthiness, God and the devil. Jordan also concludes that Africans were treated differently from whites even before slave laws were established. He referenced the fact that 4 years after the Massachusetts General Court ordered Negroes to train in the militia in 1652, that they were abruptly excluded from training the militia. Winthrop Jordan questioned this debasement of Africans up north because he argued that economic necessity was not as prevalent up north and therefore could not be determined the decision that Africans be treated differently.
Edmund Morgan would argue that white indentured servants experienced mistreatments just as African slaves had. In Gottlieb Middleberger's account on trade in indentured servants, one finds that indentured servants experienced terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, cancer, afflictions, and lamentations on board the ships to America. In another first-hand account of indentured servitude, Elizabeth Spriggs wrote in a complaint of an indentured servant in 1756 that what we unfortunate English people suffer here is beyond the probability of you in England to conceive. However, Winthrop Jordan argues in White Over Black that there isn't enough evidence to determine whether African slaves were actually treated like white indentured servants. He would use images of the stowage plan and evidence that Africans were bound together when traveling to America to suggest a greater mistreatment of Africans. He would argue that this debasement had nothing to do with economics, but about a degrading population quite different from Englishmen. In 1680, the first set of slave laws was passed, in which Act 10 reads, It is enacted that no Negro or slave may carry arms, no go from his owner's plantation without a certificate, and then only on necessary occasions, the punishment 20 lashes on the bare back well laid on, and further, if any Negro lift up his hand against any Christian, he shall receive 30 lashes, and if he absent himself, rely out from his master's service, and resist lawful apprehension, he may be killed. On one hand, Edmund Morgan would argue that this slave law, especially the denial of Negroes to bear arms, was written to protect the American labor system, and to prevent slaves from rebelling against the elite, just like the increasing numbers of freemen had done so in Bacon's Rebellion. On the other hand, Winthrop Jordan would counter-argue that the establishment of slave laws set Negroes apart from the rest of society. In this slave law, Negroes are clearly distinguished as being separate from any Christian. Jordan argues, in White Over Black, that whereas the status of white indentured servants improved over time, the status of Negro slaves only became more oppressed and restricted over the years, as African slaves became regarded as property and more slave laws were written. Our group supports Edmund Morgan's argument that slavery evolved for economic reasons. However, we are not denying that African slaves were oppressed and held a poor status. We agree that racist origins developed as slavery evolved. And as slave codes strengthened, race became a justification for slavery. Historian Rico Hillier, in Origins of Slavery and of Race, quotes historian Eric Foner when articulating that the concept of race emerged after the American Revolution as an explanation for the existence of slavery in a land that proclaimed that all men were created equal. As students, we are generally taught about racism and slavery in a condensed manner. Living in a modern society, it is easy for us to argue that racism created slavery because we know what racism means. However, we now have insight arguing that racism is a modern concept that was not established in colonial time. In fact, historian Rico Hillier argues that many historians, such as Eric Foner, see race as a modern invention. Prior to enslavement of Africans, England had always been a hierarchical society, which separated people into superior and inferior levels. Therefore, it wasn't out of the ordinary for the same habits to develop in America.